Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm Michael Schmidt. I'm the Deputy Director for Long Live the Kings, and I'm the co-founder of the Salish Sea Marine Survival Project. This is I'll explain what it is in a minute, but just to show you really quick, it's not just us, Long Live the Kings, it's a Pacific Salmon Foundation from Vancouver, Canada.
Do you want a pointer? Everyone's refused the pointer.
I got a pointer, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, see?
All right.
Yeah, I can kind of point where I need to. Okay. So I don't probably have to explain to most of you what the Salish Sea is, but that's what this little slide shows. Strait of Georgia, Juan de Fuca, and Puget Sound. It's an interconnected inland sea. It's one of the most biodiverse seas on the planet. And this is why the Salish Sea Marine Survival Project started. So this is coho, chinook, and steelhead salmon, and this is called the marine survival, or the survival of fish from the smolt size where they're exiting the river to adult size when they return. There's some river left in between where this data starts and where this data stops, because most of this comes from either smolt traps or hatcheries. So you kind of include the estuary in this picture. But what you're seeing is that over the past 30, 40 years now, there was a general decline in survival of coho, chinook, and steelhead. And if you can see really closely why these data sets only go to like 2010, they can only really go to about 2012 because it's the year of outmigration, not the year of return. So there's a lot of years in between that, and then there's years to process data. So, but what you see on the left is Strait of Georgia and Puget Sound declining, and then the coast and Columbia River, et cetera, kind of bouncing along. Steelhead's a little different. There was a big decline. At the same time, it's associated with changes in the ocean, but there wasn't really a rebound in Puget Sound where there was some on the coast. Okay, here's another reason why. This is just reinforcement why we actually started this initiative. These are Nisqually steelhead, where these are wild steelhead from the Nisqually River, had acoustic tags implanted in them. They're little tags that go in the stomach of the fish, and they ping, and there are receiver arrays that listen for those tags as you go up and out. And basically what's happening is there's a lot of loss in the 2 to 3 week period between when the fish actually exit the river and when they make it to the Pacific Ocean. Only about 15% were surviving. That's actually changed in recent years. But that happened for, relatively for about 6 years or so. So going up into this project, there was very high mortality. And then there are just other things that we know that have changed over the past 30 years. There have been declines in pollock, hake, in rockfish, some of the seabirds, certain populations of herring, and eulachon from the Fraser. This little guy down here is Neocolonus plumcris. It's a certain type of large copepod that used to be in the Fraser plume in large numbers, and it had reduced. Kelp. And on the other side, you've got increases in mammals like harbor porpoise and harbor seal, more jellies, increased number of harmful algae blooms, more temperature, and of course, more of us. So this is just framing. Okay, so what is it now? So when the Pacific Salmon Foundation, Long Live the Kings got together, we knew this had to be something pretty big and bold because not much was known at the time about what goes on in the marine environment. There's been work progressively going out into the river and into the estuary, as Eric Beamer will talk about later. But as you keep going out there, there wasn't as much known. So we knew that this had to be multidisciplinary and include a lot of folks. So it's a large effort. It has 200 plus participants now, over 60 entities involved. It's about $20 million. And the research phase is 5 years. We're in year 4 of 5. And of course, 2 countries, 1 question, what's going on with those little guys as they get out into that marine environment? Oh, hey, I'm going the wrong way. This is my NASCAR slide. This is just a shout out to everybody who's involved. And just the general objectives are, we're trying to answer, well, what happened? What happened since the 80s? Why are we having this problem with marine survival? And then also, what can we do to improve the accuracy of adult return forecasting? So there's 2 parts of this. One is like, can you do something about it? Can you find and do something about the issues? And then also, the way we forecast right now is largely based on what we know about the returning fish, the younger returning fish like jacks and whatnot. There isn't as much ecosystem data taken into account, and that's kind of a burgeoning area. And that data has promised to actually refine our ability to predict the number of fish coming back, which is huge for harvest management. So 2 parts. And what are the general hypotheses? So there's a few here. So one is that the bottom-up processes, basically things that drive prey availability, have changed for Chinook coho and forage fish, and the salmon aren't able to compensate. So some combination of, is the prey there or not, or is it in enough of abundance, and are the fish there, are the salmon there at the right time or not? So it's match, mismatch is commonly termed, but also it may just be a prey availability in general thing. The other side is the top-down processes, basically things like predation. And there's more predators now than there was 30 years ago. They could be making the situation worse, eating basically steelhead salmon and forage fish. And then there are other factors that may compound the problem. Of course, habitat loss, disease, contaminants, and what are the cumulative effects? Like how does a diseased fish actually maybe get eaten more often, for example? And then ultimately, the goal here is to be able to kind of understand these different elements and then start weighing the contribution of these various elements. So you can look at how much is driven by, say, local human influence, like water quality, and some things you could do to address it are like addressing water quality or predator management or hatchery management. Whereas if it's a regional or global impact, say if it has something to do with climate, or ocean acidification or natural cycles, then you just have to learn to adapt, right? So that's how we're trying to think about how the information comes in and then how you'd respond to it. And this is just where we are. Again, it's a 5-year study phase. There are over 80 studies going on right now. I say 25% of the research is complete because I try to be realistic. We are 4 years into it, but I know where everybody is in their work. 12 publications to date, and the process has been iterative. So we have a coordinating committee, which consists of a lot of high-level managers, and they said early on, although it's only 5 years, kind of try to do it in segments and take what you learn and then do the next thing. And that made hell for planning, but we did it. And so we're near the finish of that process. We have a little bit more planning for steelhead that we're going through right now, but we're nearly done. Okay, so the general framework follows what I explained in the hypotheses. Basically, the framework for the research focuses on a bottom-up and a top-down component, and I know there are interactions between all of these, but that's the easiest way to kind of categorize the work. So on the bottom-up, we're looking at like the food web effects from plankton on up, and then some of the physical drivers that may be affecting that, like nutrients, and temperature and other physical elements. And then, so it's both global and regional environmental conditions is what I guess I'm trying to say on the physics end. And then top down, predator, contaminants, and disease. And of course, there's complex ecosystem modeling associated with this too, to try to bring a lot of these elements together and see, again, look at cumulative effects or what maybe have more of an impact than other things. So I'm going to try to go through some highlights of where we are. A lot of this is data that's kind of in the process of being done, and I am not the author on a lot of this, so if I get it wrong, I'm apologizing on tape to the people who actually own these data. So, and I really apologize for the text, but I'm going to do it anyway. So one of the things that we're learning through this is from Lance Campbell at the Department of Fish and Wildlife, is that fry Chinook outmigrants are contributing to the adult return of Chinook in the Skagit, Nooksack, and Cowichan at 20 to 30%. And when I say fry, I mean fish that are going out. This is looking at, say, zero-age Chinook or like fallish Chinook, that fish are going out that are going out in the March time period versus fish that are going out in the May-June time period. And there's a difference. There's Skagit, Nooksack, Cowichan have this fry contribution to the adult return population, whereas the cedar, the Puyallup, and the green really don't. It's absent. So it's just an example. On the green, you have these two peaks. of this kind of March period fry out migration, and then later in May, June, smolt, I guess is what you'd say. And then if you look on the returns, it's largely dominated by the smolt group, and you don't see fry, only 1%. Whereas on the Skagit, you've got the fry, and I guess Lance is calling them par here, and you have 36% contribution to this. Is basically looking at otoliths and saying what the contribution is of the little guys to the big guys returning. And one perspective on this is you look at these different areas, and there's a difference in the estuaries, right? The ones that don't have this fry contribution are developed estuaries. And the ones that do are less developed. Another perspective on this, though, just to go back, is that there is a north to south gradient too. So the estuaries that show that missing fry element are south here, and the other ones are north. So what we're trying to do is add things like the Nisqually, where you have an intact estuary but it's south, and then a couple up in the Strait of Georgia to see if it really is that urban versus rural, or if there's something else that has to do with just the geography that may be driving this. Okay, another example of where kind of entry timing or size matters is on the South Thompson in the Fraser Basin. So South Thompson Chinook have been increasing dramatically in abundance relative to the Fraser population as a whole, whereas the Harrison population, these are kind of the two big drivers of the Fraser Chinook category. The Harrison population has been declining. The difference with South Thompson is they actually enter the marine environment like late June, July. They enter much later. So there's some question about whether or not the environment is more conducive to their survival then, or if it has something to do with their difference in size when they enter. But that is kind of other evidence that there's something to do here with kind of a match between the fish and the receiving environment that we need to understand. This further reinforces that concept. So a lot of the inspiration for the Marine Survival Project came from work on the coast that was led by, I think it's the Newport lab in NOAA's Dr. Bill Peterson and others. But there was BPA funding that allowed work to look at this, basically the same thing, this early marine survival of juvenile salmon. And they included zooplankton pretty heavily there, and they started building up this long time series of plankton, and what they found were these pretty strong correlations between a certain copepod community and the survival of certain populations of salmon. And we're actually seeing the same thing here. So this is in Admiralty Inlet, and this is the only long-term zooplankton time series we have in long. It's not very long at all. It's only to about 2003. And what you see is this a very strong correlation between this community and the change in the community structure and the survival of coho. If you guys know R squared, it's 0.84 for Central Basin, 0.83 for Hood Canal. So very, very tight correlations. And this is being expanded to look into it more. And the other part of this is that when you look at this previously, you can see there's like these zigs and zags, right? And so this is from Dr. Keister, Dr. Julie Keister at University of Washington. She's trying to say, well, what's driving these zigs and zags? And if you look at the copepod, or I don't know if this is just copepods, but if you look at the plankton community structure, it actually, in the low years, it's very different than in the high years. So there's a community structure change going on in these years. So then it leads you to ask, well, what's driving that, right? So this is kind of the way that this process is trying to unpeel the onion and get into what's actually driving the survival of these fish. So where am I on this? Okay, so I took John Stein, who used to be the director of the Northwest Fisheries Science Center's rule, and put the outcomes first and then the information to back it up second, and I always get confused when I do this. So I'm going to talk about the summary of what I'm going to show next. So other elements on this is looking at the critical growth periods for Chinook and the prey availability for Chinook. And some of the things that have been found to date are that growth in the first year is really important. Temperature in the nearshore may be limiting growth potential, and growth offshore is the highest. That there's no size-related mortality in Puget Sound, meaning that if you're of a certain size in a certain segment of Puget Sound, you're not going to be subject to mortality that's driven by size. For example, like if there's a certain gape size for predation, right? I mean, that's going to just be selective for a certain group. That's not really happening. And so it's kind of this, we're not seeing it through the period that's been done. That doesn't mean size selective mortality isn't occurring later. And it probably is, because there's a lot of evidence to suggest that growth matters, and that if you're a certain size by July in Puget Sound, that you're going to have a higher level of overall survival in the marine environment. Finding that insects, crab, and fish are really important to diets. And there's a question now with are herring and crab actually sometimes too big to eat in certain locations, and that's a line of investigation. And then there may be a south to north gradient in the relative importance of crab versus herring. Basically, you see crab in the diets in greater abundance in the offshore in the South Puget and Central Puget Sound. And as you progressively move north, there's more fish in the diets. And it's kind of like a Rorschach test. I always look at this and go, God, there's got to be a better way, but I didn't produce this, so I can't take the blame. So this is just basically showing from the estuary to the offshore, and this is diet composition. So pretty diverse as you're in the estuary near shore, and then as you move offshore, these are crabs, so they start dominating. So the Nisqually, and then Skagit, you see a lot of insects in the estuary and near shore, and then you start seeing crab dominate in the offshore. I'm sure Eric's going to have a lot more better stuff on that. The Snohomish, again, kind of insects, and then crab, and then the Nooksack, you have insects, and then a little bit more diverse as you go into the offshore, crab and fish, and actually there's a little more fish in here too you can't see. The other part that we included in this study was the San Juans. And in the San Juans, you actually clearly see a lot more fish in diets than you do in the same areas that you would be looking at in the Skagit and Nooksack, which emphasizes the importance of the San Juans as a place for foraging. This is getting into that question. Again, we were talking about mismatch earlier, and there's two areas that this is being looked at directly from a prey perspective. If you take insects, crab, and forage fish, and you peel off a couple of those, and we look at, say, forage fish and herring, and you ask the question about mismatch. This is from the Cowichan area. This is from Will Duguid. He's at the University of Victoria. But what this is basically showing is that the fish remains, the general size, the length of the fish remains in the diet of the Chinook that were caught are smaller than the average size of the herring available to them. So there's some question of, well, is this a change? Were there more herring available prior than are now? There is some evidence in some areas to show that the spawn timing of herring has moved forward, right? So that could be contributing to this. And this is just shows that it can be place specific. In the San Juans, you actually see, this is from Josh Chamberlain's work from NOAA, you see a higher contribution of herring and sand lance to the diet, and then you also see that the general size of herring and sand lance are more accommodate the size of the Chinook that are there at the same time. So there's more available to eat, which is basically showing the gray and the white are what's available to eat, and the red is what not. This is sand lance and herring. But you see just generally in June and July in particular, there's more available to eat. So the next steps on this work is just to identify the drivers of prey availability, further assess that mismatch question. And then because the zooplankton program is something that we've known even from the coast is really important, and then it's just proved itself to date. There's been a Puget Sound wide effort that was put underway that includes like 13 different entities. It's a collaborative effort to continue to collect zooplankton. that we're looking to establish it as a long-term monitoring program for Puget Sound. And then we're going to continue to assess the role and drivers of Chinook residency, because that's one part of the picture that you don't see here, is like how important are those fish that decide to stay in Puget Sound to contributing to overall survival. And then, you ask this question, well, what can you do about it? Well, you learn. So you can address water quality impacts. You could prioritize efforts to protect certain stocks of herring, for example, that have the right life history to support salmon populations. You may be able to increase the diversity of outmigrating salmon. You can prioritize estuary restoration in specific habitats. There may be some connection between crab management that we're not aware of yet. And of course, you can improve harvest forecasting. Okay, so yes, my text-heavy slides as I continue. Now we're going to go into the top-down part of this. And the primary focus has been, as many of you may know, has been on harbor seals. And the reason for that is just the change in the population of harbor seals. But as I was saying earlier, it hasn't only been harbor seals that have increased, harbor porpoises have too. And for us in Puget Sound, we've mostly been focused on that impact to steelhead, because predation seems to be the most logical reason that they're the proximate cause of mortality, meaning like what's actually causing that incidence of death. It might not be exactly why they're dying. But because they disappear within 2 weeks, they're getting eaten, right? So there was an effort to kind of narrow the scope of what different predators might be eating steelhead, and it ended up being harbor porpoises, harbor seals, and cormorants. Cormorant abundance hasn't increased significantly, so that one's not as much of a concern. And the harbor porpoise has increased significantly. It was a little later in time than the decline in steelhead. And from what we know about the guts, they don't seem to have much salmon in them. However, as Steve would say, Steve Jeffries would say, there's a really limited information on harbor porpoise. So that is a definite question mark that needs to be looked into. And there is some evidence that's been built through this project to suggest that harbor seals are actually eating steelhead. And that the impact may be less significant in years where there's more forage fish abundance. And that's through looking at the telemetry data, the acoustic telemetry, seeing how many steelhead survive, for example, out in the Nisqually to the Pacific Ocean, and then looking at the what seals are eating, and then just generally what's going on in the environment. And for the past couple of years, you guys may have noticed that, for example, anchovies, northern anchovies, are in the system more than they typically have been, and then there's just generally more bait fish. And don't know, this isn't causative, but the steelhead survival went from basically what I was showing you earlier, like less than 15% surviving through the Strait of Juan de Fuca to 48% surviving in the past couple of years. So we know something's going on and helping. And then on the other side, there's been work to look at the effect of pinnipeds in general. But this is done by Brandon Chasko from NOAA, but just basically saying that they consume now up to 6 times the commercial and recreational catch of Chinook and Puget Sound. So they actually consume, the model suggests that they consume a lot more than those folks harvesting here. So when you hear people say we've done enough on harvest management, this is a good example of like why they might say that. And then in the Strait of Georgia, the modeled estimates of impact of harbor seals on Chinook and coho has been in the 40 to 50% range. So this is just an example of really simple, smolt survival has gone up, seal abundance has gone down. But as we know, correlation doesn't equal causation. I used to show a slide where it showed the relationship between the number of political action committees and the number of people who've died falling out of their wheelchair, which had a very high correlation. Great, you're still awake. Thank you. I know this is a lot to cover, and I'm always thinking like, God, this is like 80 projects, and how do you talk about it? And I'm still learning, so thank you for bearing with me. So this is some work that's been done up in the Strait of Georgia that looks at what harbor seals are eating and what they're targeting. And what they're showing here is that actually, if you look at Chinook, coho, sockeye, pink, and chum, harbor seals actually favor eating Chinook, coho, and sockeye. And that's just that. So I don't know how else to explain that. And then again, the estimated loss from modeled estimates are 47% of the outmigrating cohorts are lost to coho are lost to predation of harbor seals, and 40% of Chinook. These may have been in potentially bad years for survival. Again, we don't know, but this is what we have. And this is the Brandon Chasko work from NOAA, just basically showing again that there's generally been if you model it, there's been a big increase in consumption by harbor seals over time. And he did this kind of cool way of looking at it. Just if you look at the relative consumption by harbor seals versus the stellar sea lions, California sea lions, and killer whales are the gray, you can see, of course, that the whale consumption rate hasn't changed much because the abundance of whales hasn't changed much. But you look at the relative, kind of looking at competition from the perspective of harbor seals dominate. Okay, so next steps here. You're trying to determine on the steelhead front if there's a forage fish, hatchery fish, steelhead survival relationship. There are still some questions about whether or not hatchery release strategies actually may be attracting predation, because hatchery fish come on in one big pulse. So is that something that actually is shifting the behavior of predators, and is there something there that could be done, again, to help? There's work to look at an impact estimate relative to what was done in the Strait of Georgia on Chinook and coho. So we're trying to do the same model, actually have the exact same model, or doing that for Puget Sound. We're trying to help promote discussions on Marine Mammal Protection Act and ESA conflicts, and just try to give people a better understanding of what may be going on with the intersect between ESA and Marine Mammal Protection. And there's a study, an action kind of study going on right now with the Squaxin tribe and the DFW, where they're actually barging hatchery coho out past certain points to see if they survive better as a potential strategy. However, there's baggage that goes along with that, because those fish can actually stray. But it's worth investigating to actually see if that does help drive survival. And again, what I said earlier about harbor porpoise, there's a lot of questions, and given the abundance of them, the change in abundance, they should be answered. A lot of things you can do, or may be able to do, if you kind of, ignore the political sensitivities for a moment. You can prioritize the recovery of certain herring and forage fish populations in general. You can experiment with changes to hatchery practices. You can increase the diversity of outmigration, timing, size, et cetera. Again, seems like a theme. You could address barriers that increase predation rates. We're looking at the Hood Canal Bridge right now as one of those potential barriers. You can affect the Marine Mammal Protection Act. It's a lot harder to think about that in this world, where we're not just dealing with a barrier and conflicts around a barrier. You can deal with harbor seal haulouts, potentially, sterilization, potentially. And you can look at also just whether or not the ecosystem is changing. If you need to just basically track harbor seal and predator abundance, you can look at transient killer whales, ask questions about what they're doing. I don't need to go into that. And then on these are the last couple. So on the disease front, we're looking basically at the populations that actually may have a problem that could be contributing to survival. Disease doesn't seem to be a broad spectrum issue that could be driving trends throughout many populations. And the primary culprit here is Nanophyades, and it's the same parasite that makes your dog sick if they eat salmon. And it travels basically through a snail that's in a watershed into fish, and then the fish carry it throughout their lives. It is a native parasite, so it's not like just inherently bad, but the concern is that the prevalence and intensity, like how many of those parasites are there. And so what's been done is a broad spectrum analysis was done to look at that in steelhead throughout Puget Sound, and high levels were found, very high levels, in the Nisqually and the green steelhead populations. And since then, the U.S. Geological Survey has developed an eDNA analysis tool so you can actually identify this parasite in the watershed, and the next steps are to kind of like identify the hotspots and find those snail colonies that carry it the most and look at ways to address that issue. And then in hatcheries, they've also developed a treatment for the water, and that's being applied already too. And on the contaminants end, again, it seems more like a population-specific thing. The loads vary amongst the various populations, and yeah, let me just quick say that. And so the primary focus has been on PBDEs in outmigrating Chinook in the Snohomish, and then in the Nisqually as well. And this just shows you what I mean by high loads of this Nanophytis. This is the parasite load in the kidneys. You see like 800 in the estuary as a load for the green, and in the Nisqually you see things like 2,000 and 1,400. In published work in like laboratory settings, a load of 295 was killing fish. They were smaller fish, but these are way, 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 way higher. So. And this is just an example of what happens when you use formalin as a treatment. You can use formalin in a hatchery and stay within kind of the MPDS loading guidelines and still kill off the parasites really fast as long as you can detect them. This is one really cool tool that's coming out of Smith Root. It's an eDNA analysis tool. One of our collaborators is Austin Thomas, and he helped develop this for them. You basically, this kind of Ghostbusters thing helps you take water samples throughout the stream and then rapidly process them with a tool from their partners on the East Coast. So you can, again, characterize the stream quickly, and we hope to be using this soon. Again, just focus on Nanophytis impacts and continue hatchery water analysis and treatment and identify those hotspots. And what can you do? You can reduce snail colonies. There's also some consideration that riparian habitat actually drives these snail colonies. So if it's largely deciduous habitat, you see these spikes in the parasite releasing their cercaria, or the cercaria, which is the parasite, leaving the snails when when foliage is off. So you see it in the spring, right before foliage comes on, or you see it in the fall, right as that foliage comes off. So there may be a relationship there in what just kind of the riparian cover is, and whether or not this parasite is actually really intense and threatens the fish. And then lastly, this is just the contaminants piece. As you see in the Snohomish, really high PBDE levels, and this is for Chinook. And so what's being done there is a broad spectrum analysis of the Chinook is taken, and then what this is from Sandy O'Neill at the Department of Fish and Wildlife. What they're trying to do is isolate exactly where that contaminant's coming from, and it looks like it's probably a water treatment plant, but we have to kind of verify that, and then the next steps will be addressing. And then on the Nisqually, same thing. This is steelhead. You see very high levels of PBDEs, and Sandy and the Nisqually tribe and the Department of Ecology are working together to put in passive samplers in the areas that are most likely to have those PBDEs coming in, and again, isolate that source and address. And that's kind of what I say there. So lastly, the two other things that are going on are this ecosystem modeling and ecosystem indicators work. And the indicators work is when you bring in time series and try to understand that data to help with forecasting and try to help explain what happened over a long term. And the modeling is what's called an Atlantis model. It's an end-to-end ecosystem model, which brings in from the physics to the fish up to the predators, et cetera, and allows you to test various assumptions in that environment, things that we can't test in the ecosystem. So this is just an example of the model structure of the Atlantis model. All this means is it's comprehensive, and a lot of functional groups. Again, it's complicated and takes a long time to build. But that's where we are. So again, only 25% of the work is done. Our focus is on trying to synthesize the results by the end of 2019. We have a management committee that's already engaged, so we constantly try to bring this information and push it right into management and get those conversations going and try to affect things like recovery plans, guidance documents, et cetera. And we're looking at developing the proper tools to help that come out of this. Basically, it's like Velcro from NASA, right? You know, there's some really cool things other than getting to the moon. We have this Atlantis model. It's an ecosystem model. It can be used to test all sorts of things, not just for what's going on with salmon. So this is really important for Puget Sound recovery. So we're trying to take this and build it into the framework. Same thing with zooplankton sampling. And then assure data from the project are accessible. This is a slow process, getting data from scientists and then putting it out there, but we're working on it. And then advocate for funding for next steps. So it's all the things we do. And of course, do what I'm doing now and continue to do it better. So one other, I always say one other thing. I'm so sorry about that. So this is the last thing. So I made a comment earlier about bringing tech to bear on thinking differently about tech. And this is something we've kind of thought a lot about lately. And when you think about communicating all the work that we all do, sometimes you see slideshows like I did and you go, oh my God, this is not going to affect the public very well. So what we did in one example is we took the acoustic telemetry data that we have from Steelhead and we made a game out of it. So basically players can go sponsor a Steelhead online. We started this last year, piloted it. You can sponsor a Steelhead. You have this great little avatar that represents any of these Steelhead, because I know a lot of you fish people think all those Steelhead look different, but they don't. Not to the general public. You got to make them fun. And then you see if your fish survives the gauntlet. Does it survive all the way out to Puget Sound, or does it die along the way? And we do this over a 2-week period, which is the natural outmigration period, and you basically get daily updates. And you're like, is my fish surviving or not? And you can follow your friends. You can watch yourself. And then you also get little tidbits of information about the science and about salmon recovery in general along the way. So it's a way to kind of you bring people into the marine environment, experience what the fish are experiencing, bring them a bunch of cool silence and little tidbits so they don't drown like you guys probably did today. And also bring the story of salmon recovery in. So, we're excited about stuff like this. If you want to sponsor a fish next year, you'll have the opportunity. But yeah, there you go.